Colin Liebich from OWA Audio, again with Alan Sides, to talk to you about our horns and how they function. Alan, there's a lot of different things we can talk about regarding horns, but let's first talk about alignment and how they really, just the basic physicalities of them.
Well, I think what you have to say is that, our horn design is fairly unique. Our true constant gravity horns, there's nothing currently manufactured that's anything like this. So as I say, it's not your grandfather's horn system from the Grateful Dead. This is another level of technology. And so the premise is, if you have a direct rating high frequency component and a direct rating mid-bass component, those components with no horn in front of them are capable of a certain level.
Sure.
Once you put a true constant gravity horn in front of both the mid-bass element and the high frequency element, you add a tremendous amount of efficiency to those devices. So what that means is, say you pick up 6 dB of gain in both the mid-bass and the high frequency sections.
Well, why would you pick up 6 dB a gain? This is important.
Because the horn, what you do, when you basically cut off the driver and you actually compress the waveform through the beginning of the throw of the driver into the horn, that allows you to pick up gain. It's almost like a step-up transfer.
Okay, so in a sense, it creates the efficiency because they don't have to work as hard.
That's right. So the point there being is that in a conventional loudspeaker, 3 circles in a box, shall we call it?
Yeah, sure.
What happens is basically when you turn that up and you're monitoring it at 90 dB or 95 dB, you're really you're getting close to the threshold of what the physics of that driver can deliver. And you can get into distortion levels as high as 10% when you start getting over 100 dB on smaller components. But now add 6 dB to that and it requires a third the power to produce the same SPL. So now all of a sudden you're super low distortion even at the loudest levels.
Gotcha.
So there are tremendous advantages to the horns if you can get rid of any of the artifacts that were not good about horns.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but talk to me about the construction of the horn. How are they made?
These are made of solid blocks of wood that are milled on CNC machines. So they're absolutely non-resonant. There's absolutely no sonic artifacts in the physical construction that'll negatively affect the sound.
So this increased efficiency, low distortion, all comes from the shape of the horn.
Yeah, the other thing to think of too is that the high frequency element, if you look at a dome, once again, a high frequency element, and you were to measure the response on axis, even though it's a dome, you would think, well, it's a half circle. Well, it's really not. If you actually start going off axis, you'll see the gain drops off fairly quickly, and the high frequency response does change as you go off axis. But in a true constant gravity horn, it's possible to get extremely linear frequency response over a very wide plane. In the case, this is in HR 3.5, but all of our systems are similar to this, where basically if you were to measure on axis 0, straight here, and go 50 degrees off axis, it's identical to 0.
So your positioning in the room, you're not so worried about once you have dispersion, where you are in the room, you're getting a fairly accurate response.
Well, the other thing to note is that like a high frequency dome element has reasonably decent dispersion, but the mid-bass or woofer part of it has fairly poor dispersion below the crossover. And so what happens is, if you're listening on a conventional loudspeaker system and you start going off axis, the mid-bass or the bass portion in the frequency just below the crossover begins to roll off gain-wise as you get off axis. So the sound of the voice changes noticeably below the crossover. If I take a woofer which has, say reasonable dispersion between 800 hertz and 400 hertz, which is just below the crossover point, it has 40 degrees of uniform dispersion. But when I cut that woofer off and I add compression to it and then I create a constant gravity horn, not only do I increase the efficiency 6 dB, but I get perfect linear dispersion of 100 degrees out of what was 40 degrees previously.
Interesting.
Our system is unique is that it has a high frequency horn and a mid-bass horn.
Right.
And they both have identical symmetry, meaning the waveforms off both are identical. The other thing that's unique is that the high frequency and mid-bass drivers are in perfect physical time alignment, which means that when you are sitting here, the arrival times of everything is exactly the same.
Well, talk to us about crossovers. How do for those out there in the world who want to understand more about a crossover point, explain that side, what the crossover is.
Well, the crossover is really a device that allows you to go from component to component. So what it basically does, if your high frequency component here, say, goes from 22 kilohertz to the high end and you want to cross it over at 800 hertz, you have to have a device that rolls the performance of the component off below a certain frequency.
Gotcha.
And there's different slopes, 6, 12, 18 dB per octave, different slopes and curves you can do for that. The same thing is true now on the mid-bass element. You want to roll the top end of it off and the bottom end off.
So we're focusing each component.
Yeah, it is. And so if a speaker is truly well designed, the crossover is perfect, and the components are symmetrically time aligned, you should be able to get 1 foot away from the speaker and not even hear two sounds. It should sound like one sound, perfectly symmetrical, without any artifacts.
Now, at one point you mentioned going above the crossover point and below the crossover point.
Well, this is another thing. A lot of manufacturers will take a component, maybe they have a high frequency element it's good to 1,000 cycles, say, as far as how low it goes, and they'll cross over 1,000 cycles. The problem with that is you really need to go a half octave below the crossover point in order to get a symmetrical curve. Because what it means is, so say that you have a high frequency element and you're going to cross 800, but it's actually flat down to 500. And your mid-bass element is actually flat out to 1K, but you're crossing over at 800. So what happens is, when you do a crossover and the two cross like this, it's perfectly linear because both the high-frequency element and the mid-bass element go well above and below their cutoff. And a lot of loudspeakers, if you actually get close to the speaker, you'll actually hear the tweeter and the mid-range as defined elements rather than hearing just one pure natural sound.
So that's a great test for our audiences to go out and get close to your speakers and listen and see if you can hear the different components. How about the magnetic structures?
Well, the thing is, to be able to get the kind of dynamic range we like. And when I say, dynamic range, say, well, does that mean how loud it goes? What it means is that from the softest to loudest, you have unlimited transient capacity, which gives you the attack and the definition clarity. So the lighter the cones are, having like aluminum voice cones and very light cones, and the bigger the magnetic structures are, the better performance you get in that regard. A lot of loudspeaker manufacturers, the magnet structures are not large enough. The frames are not cast frames, they're just stamp frames. And all those things make a big difference when you're looking at definition and clarity.
So give me just for instance, on this speaker, the HR 3.5, what is the watts per side of each speaker?
Well, in the 3.5, we have a ridiculous amount of power in 3.5, and we're running 2,400 watts on the double 12s.
Wow.
We're running 500 watts in the mids and 5 watts in the highs. In all fairness, we don't need that much power, but the amplifiers just coast. They never work hard. And the other thing too is that all of our amplifiers, the low frequency portions, have extremely high damping factors. And the damping factor is the element that controls the devices. And so the higher the damping factor is, the more definition you have in the loudspeaker.
Could we say all this headroom allows the speakers to move very fast, very efficiently?
Very fast, and they never ran out of gas. A lot of the early horn designs, from the 50s and 60s, there was a thing that was often called squint.
Right, I've heard of squint.
Well, what it basically is, and unfortunately often happens right in the middle of the vocal range. So say your high frequency horn, you're crossing at 500, it goes up to 20K. Oftentimes right around 3 or 4K, you may have a narrowing of dispersion and an increase in gain. And it's caused by this factor called squint. But if you understand the physics of when that's going to happen in the horn, it's possible to break the angle of the horn and eliminate it completely so that you'll never hear that. You can EQ it out to some degree, but you still have a narrowing of dispersion. So ours has perfectly linear dispersion, doesn't have any of the squint factor. And that's part of why our horns don't sound like horns. They sound open and they sound natural. If I'm to say, I think we've created something here that's fairly revolutionary. There's nothing physically made today by any manufacturer that would allow you, as a producer engineer, to actually have 6 people standing behind you and hear the same sound.
Well, I think that's about the best as it gets when it comes to going through horn design and why we do what we do at Ocean Way. Again, I'm Colin Liebich. You can talk to your Sweetwater SEs. Any information you might need on this product. And Alan Sides, thanks so much for going through it.
Well, thank you, Colin. Thank you for being here.